Hi, everybody. I know half of you. Thanks for joining. So this is the second of the community conversations that I have taken over from a past facilitator. And really, this is who I am. So I work for the Science Center and I run the STEM education programs. But I really like talking with others, and it's obviously something that I think I've missed a lot in the past year. And I'm always really curious about how we dialogue about things in a way that's productive and not always just like very like static sharing, ABC sharing, but more of like cyclical and loops into these new sort of themes and questions. So I showed this last time, but I think I'm going to show it every time because I really like this comic. And I think that I just want to reinforce that one of my goals in this is to, one, get better at facilitating these discussions, but really like, how can we as a group build this capacity for dialogue? Like, and the way I always look at this is like, we've got an hour together to talk about this topic, which today is gene editing. Let's just talk it out, throw ideas, take some risks, and like how you think about asking questions that you just don't know about, or sharing feelings that you're not even sure that you know why you think that, right? And as a group that we can sort of talk those things out. 4 o'clock hits, we're done. That's it. So throw it all in for the next 55 minutes. Like Ali said, you can use the standard Zoom tools, the chat, the hand raise. They're all equal platforms for communicating, in my opinion. My one sort of challenge, I think, to everyone is, as we share today, that you could try to end your thought in a question. I'm going to try out using a Google Jamboard today to kind of try to capture some of those questions. Because I get really into talking and I use my hands, it's really hard to also type. So I might wind up abandoning the Jamboard, but the goal is that we just kind of keep asking those questions that can lead to other questions. Cool. How are we feeling? Is everybody with me still already? Okay, so this is when you could use the reaction in Zoom if you want. Okay, so I want to start by saying that I am a STEM educator and by no means an expert or a scientist in the areas of cell and gene therapy, gene editing, etc. I'm a science enthusiast, right? So we have some people on the call who I feel like are way more technically inclined than I am. Feel free to chime in. This isn't meant to be like, this is my only slide that has information on it. So bear with me here. And it's really just like, let's like level set here where, and I obviously didn't make this graphic. So this is really just like, we are not going to talk about a lot of like the cell therapy and the therapeutics that are happening a lot in 3675 very much today. We're really here talking about, I want to make a distinction in gene editing between the somatic gene editing and the germline gene editing, and really thinking about, as we dialogue about different scenarios, which I'm going to pose to you as we choose kind of what direction we want to talk about today, that these are technologies that that are currently used, right, in research and like clinical applications. But it's, I think, the most important thing, and I would love to hear other thoughts on this to distinguish when we talk about gene editing, is how it permanently affects DNA, right? And there's, I think, part of the importance of this is like, my goal here is that you can, what do you need to talk about when you sit down with your family or your friends at a dinner table? And when you think about the future of questions that you're going to have to ask about your own healthcare or the health of other family members, how does gene editing, what part does that play in your future, which I was talking to Siobhan earlier, I think it will, right? At some point, you will kind of be faced with, what are my perspectives and thoughts on gene editing? Now, that's not, if I choose to have a child, how would I design that child, right? It's probably way less that, and way more in thinking about these like cell and gene therapies that are preventing and potentially curing diseases, right? So main distinction I'd want to make is that the germline gene editing is the gene editing that we're is editing embryos, right? Where that's where that DNA is modified early enough that it is a permanent change in the DNA from here on out. The somatic gene editing is way more of what we see in clinical applications right now, where you are actually often removing cells from the body, editing those cells, and reintroducing them to prevent or cure diseases. How's that sound? Anybody want to add anything to that? Okay. So I have so many resources because, again, like I just spent the past couple of weeks being like, oh God, I don't know anything about this. What do I want to know? What do I think is interesting, right? But usually we think about gene editing as like, how is it actually like curing or lessening symptoms of disease, right? That's really like the goal. And then I think a framework for this, I know this is a slide with a lot of text and I always try to avoid this, but it's 10 bold predictions. So you can't not put all 10 there. And I think this is super helpful when we think about how it's not like gene editing is this rogue thing where like there's no oversight and it's just people are doing crazy stuff with DNA. Maybe that's happening silently, but for the most part, we have all these regulatory, we have huge national organizations like the National Human Genome Research Institute that helps us to think about what are we doing now and where do we want to go. So in the scenarios that I'm about to pose to you to choose kind of how you want to think about your opinions about these, I really pulled them in thinking about how in the next 9 years, when's 2030? What are we at? So in the next 9 years, which is really not that far away, here are the predictions for where sort of genetic engineering, genomics, really like where we expect to be. Now, I like that they call them bold predictions because it sets them up to like totally not reach them, right? But you don't see that embryonic editing on here, right? You don't see that those more extreme technologies, right? So I don't really, my scenarios that I'm about to pose to you are not like, what do you think about being able to make your future offspring be 7'5", right? We can talk about that if that's what people want to talk about, but enhancement is like, I think enhancement will kind of be woven into some of these discussions, but like these are all the things that we have to think about before we even think about some of those things. For the most part, right? There's like extreme outliers, I think, that we could talk about also. But so my scenarios that I'm pulling are really from like thinking about how we're using, mostly it's like how we're using our own genetic information. Like, how do we want to use it? How are healthcare providers using it? How are private companies like able to use it, right? Things like this. Is everybody still with me now? That's the last long slide, and then we're gonna. Cool. So the way I like to think about these discussions is I'm going to pose, I really wanted to be 2, but I just couldn't help myself. And I think of 3 scenarios here. And you in the chat are going to write 1, 2, or 3 based on what direction do you want this conversation to go for the next 45 minutes. They're all going to have similar themes, I think, but we're not going to move on until people vote, unfortunately, because the whole thing is engagement, right? So all you have to do is write a number. So scenario 1, and 2 of these are pulled from these bold predictions. So you, Bruce, Siobhan, Melissa, Joe, right? You get your complete genome sequence and you have that information along with some annotations of that genome on your smartphone. I love the use of the word smart. On your phone, where they're all smartphones at this point, right? On your phone. So that you can pull up. It's an app, it's a secure app that you use your thumbprint or whatever to open, but that's there on your phone. This is the scenario, right? Period. Next scenario. This one's longer, sorry for all the text. So this is based on a National Institute of Health study. I think it's called All for Us, All in One. I can't remember what it's called. But this is like a sort of a simpler version of that. So you, again, all the people I called out, right? You decide to participate or not decide to participate in a national research program that gives you all this like info, like it's all the ancestry info, it's all about your traits. It has your potential health risks for disease. And it also gives you some insight into how your body might react to certain medications. It also allows approved researchers to use this de-identified DNA. So that means somebody has the keys to your all of your information, but not anybody can just access. Not any researcher or postdoc can be like, I want, like Melissa's genetic information because she seems like a perfect candidate for this study, right? It's de-identified like most health information is now. So this could lead to better treatments and disease prevention by having a larger sample of genetic information to pull from to do studies. All right, scenario 2, last one. Scenario 3, this is straight from the bold predictions. Genomic discoveries will benefit everyone in society equally. Right, so there's a lot of avenues here. Lines are not always clear between therapeutics, what diseases are, and non-therapeutic purposes. This is where we could get into enhancement a little bit, and even like things like eugenics, like what are the directions of that these technologies could take, and who will they benefit? Okay, so I'm gonna actually, I wish I could put all these 3 on a. Does everybody? I don't have them all on one page because I was trying to avoid the text, right? So you have. Number 3, I'll start from the beginning. 1, you got your all your genetic information on a smartphone. Cool. Number 2, you can do this research study where they give you like all the information you need to understand like everything from ancestry to traits and, but there is like people do have access to your information to do studies, your genetic information. 3, discoveries will benefit everybody across society. Okay. How do I stop sharing? I'm going to stop sharing for a second. Cool. All right. Now it's time to vote on what you think, which discussion avenue you would like to take. If you're not sure, even just throw 1, 2, or 3 in the chat, right? Because they all have some overlaps.
While people are answering, Maya, I just wanted to mention, George asked in the chat, you mentioned national oversight. What about international Wild West R&D?
Oh, international Wild West R&D. The Harvard article I read didn't talk about the international Wild West. Sure. So do you feel you mentioned do you feel comfortable elaborating on that anymore, or should I just kind of, or does anybody else actually?
Oh, I did that of a specific example of in mind, and I forget the name of the person, but this Chinese doctor who did, research gene gene fiddling with human embryos. And the whole thing was, I can't think of a polite word for it, but beyond Wild West irresponsibility.
Yeah, so that's a whole topic that I think, that totally. So there's the Chinese researcher who was editing embryos to select out for HIV or to select for HIV resistance. Is that right, Siobhan? I feel like you would
something like that. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
Right. And so actually, so he wasn't like a biohacker who was like just kind of secretly in his basement, right? So he was part of the scientific community. But there are a lot of really fascinating discussions from there. So I think the scientific community, by and large, internationally, nobody was on board with this, right? Nobody was like, yeah, but we have a lot of really interesting insights, right? Because he took those 10 bold predictions, he went all the way, right, to the germline editing. Siobhan, do you want to add anything to that?
It's interesting because I think you are exactly right. He was roundly criticized by even the Chinese government, and I believe he's in prison now. So that might be a deterrent, might not be a deterrent in the future. But it's these transgressions that happen within science. If you think about the story of Henrietta Lacks, who had her cells stolen at Johns Hopkins, and now they are in every biochemistry lab in the world. So the ethical question is, well, we didn't get her cells through her permission, but they are used everywhere. So it's a really ethical fine line of can you benefit from ill-gotten information? And there you can, but is it the right thing to do? So I think that this time around, having been through some of that experience where, you know, the way the material was obtained was underhanded or, you know, against the morals of the time, that I think that you will not see anyone using or referring to that scientist's work, unlike Henrietta's cells, who are in every lab. And that poses a dilemma that we had to address ourselves at the Gene Editing Institute as we're creating an educational curriculum to say, you know what, the HeLa cells, everyone is trained on them, but here's this book that said they were taken from this woman without her knowledge. So it's not just gene editing, but it's an issue within medical research broadly. And as the world gets more sophisticated and there are new ways to underhandedly obtain information, it's something that, you know, is there an authority in place? I'm going to try and answer with a question, Maya. Like,
yeah, great. Go ahead.
So what would be a compelling enough authority, you know, other than your, you know, the moral code of scientists, but the World Health Organization, you know, they don't come and put people in jail. In this case, China did. So what would be a proper deterrent for punishing scientists who are getting research through means that are not ethical?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it actually leads perfectly into the choice based on my, Ali, I don't know if you came up with something different, but I came up with number 2, the scenario number 2 as being overwhelmingly the one. And I think you guys did a great job because I think it really encompasses like kind of all of the questions potentially. So I'm going to share my screen again. And I'm just going to keep this as like a note taking here. And I'm going to put the Jamboard in the chat for you. Where is my chat? Shoot. So anybody can add to it. But again, for anybody who's new here, we have decided that the direction of this gene editing benefits and risks questioning session is really going on this idea that you, would you, I mean, one of the questions is like, would you do this? Would you participate in a national research program? Let's say it was put on by the National Institute of Health, right? Or the, you know, so a vetted organization, right? And the exchange is that in exchange for you giving samples to sequence your genome, understand information about your genetics, that, you know, that you would get the information on your ancestry, traits, potential health risks, and how your body might react to certain medications. And in exchange, it's offering that your information is in a secured database, right, where researchers can, approved researchers can request your information, right? So I guess to weave in Siobhan's question here, does that make you feel safe? Right? Like, is that, oh, thanks, Sally. Is that enough? Is that enough of an oversight, like something like the National Institute of Health, that you would feel comfortable securing your genetic information there? Would be like one question for the group.
I'm going to jump in with this. To a certain extent is already happening with companies like Ancestry.com and 23andMe. You have to, if I remember, they might have changed it, but at one point you had to opt out of your genetic material being available to researchers and police departments. The police department especially is where there's an interesting ethical dilemma, but it also helped catch the Golden State Killer. So I don't know how to answer that with a question, but thinking about like the next level of what they can do with that DNA that's already being stored and the data is already there, what can they do in the future with it?
I'll pose it in the form of a question. Can a government organization like the NIH be any worse than a for-profit company like 23andMe?
So wait, say that. So can they be any worse? So, right.
That
So you're
was,
really questioning just because they're a federal agency, like your question, keep going on that a little bit.
I guess it was to try and put it in the form of a question.
You can just state it and then we can,
Yeah.
You
No,
go ahead first.
I think in some respects it's better in that within the government there is more oversight within government from other government agents and even the public. So I would answer that as hopefully yes, but since it was asked to be phrased in the form of a question, I guess it came out negative.
Yeah, no, I appreciate just the thought in general. And I think, yeah, because I think what we get to when we like dig a little deeper into this question is about ownership of your genetic information, right? To me, this is really fascinating because I'll just throw this out there. Like, I don't feel a particular ownership over my own genetic information, but I can see totally why people would, especially Americans. It sort of feels like it would make a lot of sense that you would it's yours, right? Does anybody both agree? Like, does anybody sort of see where I'm coming from or feel strongly opposed to what I'm saying? And I invite that also.
I see it as an extension of the way personal data is now being abused and abused. And some people are perfectly okay with that. Others want a slice of the pie. If somebody's going to make money off of my click history, why shouldn't I? And others might feel it's an invasion of privacy. So I think there should be this kind of conversation in a very broad way so that people at least have a better understanding. I think signing a bunch of gibberish legalese to 23andMe is not understanding what's going on.
Yeah, that is interesting. I think a lot of these things come back to how things in our society are manipulated, how our data is already manipulated or used to whose advantage, right? So I think there's this natural tendency to assume that if you had your whole genome sequence and you sort of locked it away with the NIH, that just what's an approved researcher and what are they doing with it?
Yeah.
What are they doing with it? What are they doing with it? So if you have studies where there's thousands and thousands of samples, right, with full genomes, how could it be manipulated in a way that would be destructive to an individual or society? I don't have an answer to this. Right? But I think it could be and couldn't be. What are the ways that in my opinion, right, if it wasn't locked away, that you went to the doc. Oh, this is the other thing that I think Siobhan was telling me. You're born and you get a birth certificate, and then you also get a full genetic, I guess, would you say your whole genome, right? You would have all that genetic information that you could take home with you, but it was also in the healthcare system, right? So everybody, it's out there, everybody, you don't have consent anymore. What are the most extreme, terrible things that happen with this, with all of this information being out there? It probably has to do with capitalism. Does anybody have any thoughts? Right? It probably has to do with private companies making money. How could money be made off of you?
So I guess the thing that came up before that you guys can hear me right was that was a concern was say well, at least back before we had insurance, health insurance that was not no pre-existing conditions sort of things, and your health insurance company could look at your genome and say, you know what, they're likely to have diabetes or who knows whatever, so their insurance is going to be much higher than other people's. That was a concern upon the time. And this is an example, and one thing maybe I'll mention this is I suspect that everyone's DNA being available to other people is largely going to end up being inevitable, and just because it's going to be, I don't know. So you get an example of all of those wildly unrealistic crime shows with the FBI or whatever, and they get someone's DNA, because they pick up a cup that someone held, and then they send it to the lab, and 10 minutes later they have their DNA or whatever, in some magical way. Eventually, it will be extremely easy and inexpensive to get DNA, and it's just easy to to anyone, unless you're not going to touch anything or go anywhere or breathe or whatever, out in public, it's going to be quite possible, maybe not, I don't know, it's going to be worthwhile for other, businesses or whatever to grab everyone's DNA, but it'll be impossible to protect it and keep it secret. To which the point, I think we maybe have to ask what kinds of laws we want to put in place about restricting how it can be used or collected, because it will be, you simply will not be able to keep it secret. The same way right now, facial recognition is everywhere and growing, and all these things can identify people's faces. DNA will be like that someday in the future, not this year or next year, but in a few decades or something. So maybe I would ask how we want to handle that, because it will come. It's always good if the ethics can at least be not too far behind the technology.
Yeah, thanks. I have an idea. Does anybody want to add to that?
Yeah. Basically, like previous commenters said, we have some laws in place to keep people from using information discriminating in terms of health insurance, but there really aren't any laws in place to keep a company from discriminating with other kinds of insurance, like life insurance. You got a gene for a bad heart or a certain type of cancer, you could be the healthiest guy in the world. You'll never get a policy, and a lot of times you'll never know why. Employment would be another one. Employer decides they want to lower their insurance costs by having a healthier workforce. They use genetic screening, all of a sudden, boom, they're eliminating candidates, and the poor candidate doesn't know anything about why they're being eliminated. It's because somewhere in some DNA database somewhere, they're referenced.
So, yeah.
And there's no guarantee the reference could be correct.
Yeah.
It could be bad information. And it's going to follow them the rest of their life.
I agree with that, Bob. I think, if we even think about this a step higher, it's denying people opportunities based on what their DNA might say.
Exactly.
That takes away personal freedom to make a choice about how you want to live your life based on some, metrics that might be behind the scenes about how long you might live or what conditions you might have and what jobs you might be able to pursue. So it even goes way beyond discrimination. It could really shape your future and your destiny, even if you want to get really fancy, Maya, and put like, how could this shape individual destiny? That is a risk, but it's also could be a reward for the individual who knows that they are going to get Parkinson's or have a good chance of that, or some other disease, to be taking medications or medical treatments well in advance to stall it. Because one thing I think that hasn't come up yet is that DNA is really shaped by the environment as well. So it could turn out to be a tool for good. So we know that there is the epigenetic layer of how your genes collide with the environment. And, if you knew that you were a strong candidate to get lung cancer, would you smoke? I hope not. So you would do everything you could to prevent that. And I think that that destiny issue is actually double-sided. One, it could control it in a bad way, or it could help you in a good way. Fascinating.
Yeah, to me, it seems like this information should be falling under like the HIPAA laws. Okay, whether or not you have the gene for Parkinson's should be between you and your doctor
Yep.
and not publicly available for sale.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting because I think that it's safer for us to couch this entire discussion in healthcare. Safer, not the safest, right? But Bob, I think you brought up like the workforce discrimination is like a fascinating thing. That's where we go straight to dystopia, right? Where we're like, you know, that's where eugenics, that's where all of these conversations come in when we kind of step outside of healthcare. Because if you were like, look, we have these technologies that could basically identify if you could die of a disease and we can prevent that. That's great. Who doesn't want that? Right. But then when we step outside a little bit, outside of HIPAA kinds of that healthcare, it is when it gets quickly fuzzy. Bruce, were you going to say something?
I was going to bring up something else, which there was a case sort of like several years ago, which was, I don't know, I don't think it was genetic based. I believe it was something along the lines that someone had gotten a blood test. It might have been for donating blood or something like that, and and whoever did the blood donation uncovered that this person had some kind of disease that they didn't know about and neglected to share it with them because it wasn't really it was like someone giving blood to at a blood bank or something like that. And so it wasn't, the purpose of it wasn't to do diagnostics for that person and tell them what something they have, but in the process this whoever did it discovered that this person had some dangerous condition that needed to be treated and just failed. It wasn't their job, so they didn't tell them about it, and that person suffered accordingly. And later on it was discovered that this was known like a year ago, and they were it was cancer or something and got much worse, and as a result of when an early intervention would have helped. And I don't know what rules along those lines may be that if someone is using your genes to study something and they discover something, that they need to share that information with you. I don't know. That's
so your
question
idea. I kind of tried to interpret your question where like what is the responsibility of that person who saw that, right, in whatever way they saw it, like to convey that? Because it makes me think about how healthcare right now is, lawsuits are rampant, and like how, I mean, the idea, and I don't have I have no good answer for this, but we say it like, and then here's your genome on your phone, and then you're like, and the doctor's like, oh yes, yeah, so lung cancer, it's almost like fortune telling. It seems like, right, you're like lung cancer, and it's not actually like that. But I would question how ready the scientific community, that we're here, right, how ready is the healthcare community at having your home, your family care provider having the skill set to inform or make, what is the responsibility, and how prepared, or what does the future healthcare workforce have to look like to be able to advise you? Yeah, that would be my question.
I also wonder about, I know one of your questions had talk about like equality and equity, and Siobhan was mentioning epigenetic factors and how, and those getting passed down. You think about which groups of people have been targeted by food deserts, by pollution, and maybe acquiring a lot of negative health factors. And you're talking about capitalism, and I just think about like, if Burger King knew where there were populations of obesity or diabetes, would they target those areas? Or if a tobacco industry would be interested to know where there was history of lung disease, and would it just make it worse for those groups?
Right. I don't know how to phrase that exactly, but yeah, I think that's powerful, because it's not just, you can say like all genetic information is created equal, but the external environmental factors we know are not, which gets into all of these like interesting discrimination potentials. That's not a question, Maya, but yeah, I'm just recapping what Emily said.
I do also want to call out something that George had put in the chat earlier, talking about one of the potential benefits that perhaps your genome could be a unique identifier, better than forgeable documents, if that was attached to you, if it could be used that way, which is an interesting perspective.
George, do you want to say anything about that? I was just typing, so.
I'm ignorant about the science of it, but it seems to me that it's much better than, you know, signatures and seals and even fingerprints, in that you carry it with you. I mean, you can lose a finger, so. But I guess when the government takes your fingerprint, as they take all 10 or however many available. But yeah, that it would be a way of authenticating things like one man, one vote, or I should say one person, one vote. That there's so many things in our world require an identity, and you carry these stupid documents, and if your driver's license expires, suddenly I'm no longer 65, I'm 17 and not allowed to buy beer. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, so yeah, that's a really valid point. I really thought about it like that. Yeah, does anybody have any other thoughts on that, or sort of on this question in general?
I've got a more general comment. Generally, when you use biometric data for security purposes, like ID and things like that, the real problem is if it gets hacked, you can never undo it. If someone gets your password, you change your password. If somebody gets a copy of your DNA and figures out a way to fake it, that's like undoable.
Yeah. Yeah, this gets back to the question that I asked earlier, where about ultimate harm. Like, as a teacher, I'm always like, what's the worst case scenario in this class? Like, some student spills like all of the materials that we need, and then what do we do, right? Like, in this case, like, what's the worst case scenario here, where you like all that information gets out to who wants that information that could do harm, right? In the same way that like people buy your data, your information, to be able to like spam you, right?
Well, it would just be identity theft.
Yeah.
So maybe we should be asking what what DNAs or this information should and should not be used for.
Okay.
For example, I mean, what Bob was saying there is an example that maybe it's not very good as an identification point, because once it's stolen, it's stolen forever, which means it's unfixable. So that there may be certain things that we should restrict its usage for certain purposes, because it's too dangerous to use it there, or something like that.
So let's be like more benign here. Like, what should genetic information be used for? What does everybody feel like is just like a very like, it's hard to argue that your genetic information should be used to do what with, let's say, in this secure database with approved researchers who are requesting your data. And this would be any like, Siobhan, do you have any thoughts on this? Because I feel like you could actually speak to like what it is currently being used for more.
Well, and it all goes back to belief systems. So if you trust physicians who take a Hippocratic oath to do no harm, you have to believe that, and you have to say, well, okay, my physician is working with me one-on-one. Some of the things that are low-hanging fruit, we know that genetic counseling is a new field that's grown up. It's a master's degree. There's one at Jefferson. Every health system employs genetic counselors. They are coaches for individuals to decide how to address risks. So the most famous example of this is Angelina Jolie. I'm sure she had a discussion with her physician and genetic counselor about the fact that she had multiple women in her family who had breast cancer at an early age, plus the fact that she had probably both BRCA genes being positive. So that conversation, you asked what's the worst thing that could happen. Well, you could cut off parts of your body that you didn't need to. that would be a bad thing. But these are heavy decisions. So it runs a continuum of there are life-changing decisions that you'll have to make based on something that you learn, but it has to be highly tested. You don't use the 23andMe test, although they do have a BRCA offering. You have to send it out to a real medical testing company. And then what the genetic counselor does when she sits down with you is to draw a family tree to understand how the environment has interacted with your family's DNA over time. And those things help to have that discussion. Now, Maya and I talked a little bit about, well, okay, just say 23andMe tells you that you have a celiac gene. And the cure for that is to not eat wheat. And maybe your intestines will be healthier because they don't get beat up by the gluten, all this gluten-free. And in fact, if you don't have that, maybe you don't have to buy the expensive gluten-free stuff off the shelf. So those are kind of, it's a vast continuum, isn't it? It's like life-threatening implications where maybe we assign you a counselor to really sit down, look at your personal data, think about the very recent medical knowledge about the field. And this is starting to go beyond cancer into cardiology, into cardiomyopathies, inherited conditions that might tell you simply that you need to start seeing a cardiologist when you're 35 instead of 65 because of a certain pattern that they see. But I think the common theme that I'm seeing is that there's an interaction with a new type of healthcare provider who is proactively coaching you and is on your side. And I don't know if people feel that about physicians or not. I'm not a physician. I work with plenty of them at my health system, Christianacare. You do trust them with your life when it comes down to the ultimate decisions that you have to make. But on the easy end, there may be low-hanging fruit of food allergies, or if you are prone to extra sunburn, or some very minor conditions that would be, I would call that quality of life improvement. So how do we tier or stratify the risk based on the impact? I think that's a good question, and it does go back to how do we feel about our healthcare teams and providers? Are we feeling that we only pay them to go and see them and kind of fix things, or can we shift perception so that healthcare teams are really helping you live your best life over the course of your lifetime? That doesn't happen very much, but I think it's an opportunity.
Thank you. I haven't been observing the chat, but I think it's pretty rich here. Let's see, ethics and more. Start with common data and privacy as a test sandbox for how corporate and government entities use personally identifiable information. Nefertiri, do you want to share any more about that? I mean, it's pretty clear, but do you want to elaborate?
Yeah, I can't come off camera, but
that's okay.
Yeah, just thinking about how much we trust those that manage or handle our data, social media. When you purchase a home, Google Earth can zoom in, and anyone can get access to your information from some of those public records. So if we're thinking about the quote unquote fingerprints of our genetics, if we just start with what's happening right now, and legally how the individual citizen or the owner of their information doesn't actually control or have ownership over their name and their address and their social security number. Once it's out there, someone had brought up the cybersecurity aspect of it. Once a breach happens, it's kind of out there in the black market, and there's not a whole lot of responsibility taken by the organization that was hacked. So I could see similarities and look at it as an opportunity to start now.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think I think this is the theme. It's like trusting healthcare, and just like, who do you trust with something as sensitive as this information is kind of what I keep hearing. I wanted to bring up those two kind of like ethical, or they're like dinner table questions, which is something kind of to walk away with too, as you think about how to explore this more. Because one of them, a lot of like off of what Siobhan was saying, like, let's say somebody in your family has seen a genetic counselor. They are 15, right? Maybe it's your sibling, maybe it's your child, whatever. And the information was given from the genetic counselor that they could take a medication that would prevent a heart disease, or, I guess I'll just use heart disease for right now, or some sort of illness, right? Does that 15-year-old start taking preventative steps through that interpretation, or I wouldn't even call it interpretation, through like by reading and translating that that genome sequence, right? That's a really interesting question, because I do, as like a science enthusiast, I do feel like that is a question that we should all consider, right? Like, what do you think about that? Also, this other idea of like outside of the sort of like healthcare system, you have like sort of like the more startup question, which is like, Siobhan shared this company with me that it's sort of like more around modeling, where it's like, let's say I have been chronically depressed through this pandemic. Let's just say, no, I was kidding. So, right, let's just say that is true. And I don't want to just start experimenting with psych meds, right? Like, I don't want to just start experimenting with different medications. I want somebody to be able to use my genetic information to see how likely, based on my environment and genetics, that would be to be successful in terms of alleviating my depression. How do we feel about that? Like, do we think that how do we feel about that in general, using modeling and even just like having companies that you can go to say, I'm thinking about Prozac, but I want you to run these tests first to see if it will work before I take it. Oh, Melissa, saw a commercial for that thing last night, really? All right, so yeah, so it's there. And I think it's wise to have a developed opinion about this, whether that means like we like do more research or just what people think about that, as being like right in front. But I also think it's really smart. Yeah, Genomind. Yes, that was it. So check it out. But I also think it's like thinking about the Jefferson, offering that as like part of your benefits package at your work, including genetic counseling and that. What do you think about that? But then we're also on like, it is the other side. Does anybody, I want to stop talking now. Does anybody else have, I'm like recapping a lot of things because I think they're really fascinating. Does anybody have anything that they've kind of been sitting on? Like, they're like, this isn't related to what they're talking about, but I want to throw it in there? Or questions?
I guess I have a certain question that I've been kind of sitting on. But you mentioned like the HALA cells before, but I was kind of wondering, like, what if a scientist uses an individual's genetic info and it leads to like a scientific breakthrough, even though like in this case, the information would be de-identified? Like, would there possibly be a way to have compensation or recognition for that individual? Or would it just kind of be anonymous at that point?
That's such a great question.
I would argue that there's no, and I wrote this on the Jamboard, there's no way to actually de-identify DNA if we get to the point. I feel like it can always be traced back to us. It would take some, a paper trail, but I think it's impossible to completely remove.
So I have this question this friend is not on the call. So this question was, I wrote here because I went for a walk with a friend the other day who it did exactly that. Melissa was about to participate in a study that would be beneficial to like a very specific population of medical condition, and decided against it at the last minute because they did not think that it was possible to de-identify data. Because even if you have like whatever, like just sort of genetics or sort of a bunch of like, you know, gene sequences, you also have all of these this personal information, geography, like background, education, like all these things that it narrows you down so much that if somebody wanted to figure out who that was, you could. And he pulled out of the study because of that. I think it's really valid. What does de-identified mean, and how would we make that more secure, which kind of goes back to the security issues. Yeah, any other thoughts? Thanks for sharing that, Allie. That was a good thought too. I appreciate that.
I think it might be interesting to think about this in the context of other industries like the internet. So at one point there was website number one and everyone was afraid, and you know, what's going to go on this internet, and look at how it's developed. It's now the cloud, and people do trust it to do all types of things. So, you know, kind of how could we learn from other industries lessons that might help us develop in a positive way that could be regulated, and it could create some ground rules for people to have that trust. The other industry I'm really thinking about here right now is Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. So for some reason, those databases that hold the value are uncrackable. So is there some way to learn from another industry that what if we stored our DNA in a cryptocurrency type of database that only the individual had access to, and you could portion out a key, or you know, a one-time access. So I think the main goal of kind of seeing the 10 years down the road, the 9 years down the road. A friend of mine likes to say, you threw your hat over there, you identified that we're going to have all this capability. And now over the next 9 years, we're going to have to figure out how that all works. And maybe how can we learn from other industries, how they solve similar problems?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Agreed. This is a beautiful Jamboard, everybody. We're done now. We might never look at it again, but take a look and think about taking one of these Post-its along with you to kind of like consider. Yeah, I think all these questions we could spend another hour talking about. But I also think it's like this ethics and then actual research. Like the science is out there, it's happening. Companies are springing up that are like taking advantage of some of these technologies. So like, let's learn about them and let's decide what we think about them, because society has to also, you know, like exist alongside the science itself. I think that's it. I feel like this is a good natural end. We're going to do this again next month with a topic that's completely different. It's around med tech. What it's going to be about, I have no idea yet, but the conversation can be about anything. So it's happening, I think, June 10th, but look out for community conversations. And yeah, join us again, bring your ideas. I love this, and I appreciate all of your volunteered thoughts and the conversation in general. Special shout out to Siobhan for just like really helping me think about this too.
Thank you. It was really interesting. Great discussion.
All right. See you all next time.